Hello, everyone, and welcome to Wisdom Wednesday with the Charlotte Center for the Humanities and Civic Imagination. My name is Jennifer Dow. I am the CEO and founder of Piko Fellowship, and I serve here on the Charlotte Center team in communications and marketing. I am here first to welcome you, so welcome. Glad to see everyone here. And second, to share with you how to engage with today's session. The first 30 minutes of our time together will be a conversation between Angela and our host and our guest. As you listen, we invite you to share your thoughts in the chat. Next, we will open it up to you to ask questions. We invite you to put those questions in the chat, or better yet, if you're willing, come on screen and we'll have you ask your question in person. We invite each of you to turn on your cameras if you're comfortable. It is my pleasure to introduce Angela Gala.
Hello and welcome to Wisdom Wednesdays. My name is Angela Gala and I'm with the Charlotte Center for the Humanities and Civic Imagination, and I'll get my mouth right in just a minute. To begin our event this month, I am going to read a passage from Maya Angelou's A Letter to My Daughter. I am convinced that most people do not grow up. We find parking spaces and honor our credit cards. We marry and dare to have children and call that growing up. I think what we do is mostly grow old. We carry accumulation of years in our bodies and on our faces. But generally, our real selves, the children inside, are still innocent and shy as magnolias. We may act sophisticated and worldly, but I believe we feel safest when we go inside ourselves and find home, a place where we belong, and maybe the only place we really do. Wisdom Wednesdays is a series of conversations between us. It is us together being onto something. I would like to thank our sponsor and partner, Ortho Carolina, for this series, along with all of our donors and supporters for their investment in our efforts and in our community. You make our work possible. I'm proud to be part of this team at the Charlotte Center. Our mission is to help people and communities flourish. And now I get to introduce you to my friend, Joseph Piko Ewoodzie Jr. He is our guest today, and Piko is an associate professor of sociology at Davidson College. He uses qualitative methods to examine how marginalized populations in urban areas make sense of inequalities in their everyday lives. Piko investigates how people interpret their social selves and order their relationships, how they create, maintain, and transform social and symbolic boundaries, and how boundaries constrain and enable their lives. His dissertation will be published in his new book, Getting Something to Eat in Jackson, an ethnography of everyday eating practices among socioeconomically diverse African Americans living in Jackson, Mississippi. Piko earned his MS and Ph.D. in sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Now that is the official bio and introduction. Piko would have preferred that I just tell you he teaches school. How I experience Piko is that he shows up with his heart wide open and ready to engage with the world in order to make sense of it. Welcome, my friend.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for being with us. Now, you and I have had several conversations on belonging. Sometimes they're conversations, sometimes they're debates, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't think we've ever really settled it, which is so wonderful. And I want to start by kind of sharing, I'm going to back up a little bit to give our guests some time to know you. And so why study belonging?
So I think in sociology, it would probably be odd to say that I study belonging, right? It gets wrapped up into a lot of different things. But I sort of settled on it when I was getting ready to go to Jackson to do my research. And a mentor of mine mentioned that, essentially all that we're trying to do as sociologists is to figure out why is there an us and a them? And I think if we look around us, there's always an us and a them. And all we're trying to figure out is, how have we made life, how do we go about making life as easy as possible for the us, for the us to thrive, to flourish, and to live to their highest potential? And how do we go about making life as difficult as possible for the them to, in some ways, curtail their humanity and curtail the ability to flourish as much as possible. And, that gets wrapped up in a whole bunch of different things, people who study economic inequality or racial inequality or gender inequality. Inequalities is at the heart of what we do as sociologists. And so for me, when I was sort of thinking about it like that, I came to this idea of belonging as, I guess that's what we're doing. We are trying to figure out who is the us, who is in, who belongs, and who doesn't, and how do we balance those two different things. I'll leave it there for now. I'm sure there's plenty more to be said.
Well, so are you talking about on an institutional level or a personal level, or both?
Okay, so I think for personally, it's at both levels, right? Sociologically, we're most interested in as much of the aggregate as possible.
Okay.
But I would like to think of myself as a humanist-minded sociologist. And so when I'm sitting there and talking to somebody one-on-one, talking to this particular person, I care about that person in front of me, not what they represent in the larger sense of it, but I care about that person in front of me and thinking about it. So I'm in Jackson, Mississippi. It's probably my third week there. And it's pouring, it's raining. And there's this man, Billy, who I met at the homeless shelter. I think at that point, I'd spent about 4 weeks with Billy. And Billy kept talking about his daughters and he wanted me to meet his daughters. So I go to Billy's daughter's house and we're sitting there and we're talking, and I'm looking around and sort of the amount of poverty that I see around me, I was empathetic to, because it reminded me of Ghana. It reminded me of back home growing up in Ghana. And so I was just looking around at all of this stuff, and I just couldn't believe, one, the pride that he had in his daughters as they were trying to make sense of their lives and make things happen. It was a real human sort of like joyous pride in this young woman doing the best they can to raise their children, Billy's grandchildren. So that was like the positive humanist version of this. And then the other part that kicked me was that, in 10, 15 years, these children are supposed to compete with some of our children for a seat at a place like Davidson College. That's just not going to happen. The game is rigged in that sense. These kids are not going to live their potential, right? If I'm putting it in the bluntest of terms. So the evening is done and I'm walking back because I parked a little further away. I'm walking back and it's raining, and the little tears and the little rain sort of slapping my face at the same time. And I'm just saying, there's something about this that's just not right or fair, or I don't know how we want to put it, but like we simply do not value the lives of certain groups of people as much as we do other people. And every time that I see an instance in which we are making it harder for people to live their fullest potential, that's a sign of me. For me, that's a sign. That's a piece of evidence that says we don't think you belong as much as this other people. So that's in some ways, that's how it makes sense to me. So I care about that particular family on that particular day when I was them. And these are folks that I'm still in touch with. So I care about it on that level, them personally. But I think because of my training, I'm also able to zoom out and say, for this reason and this reason and this reason and this reason. Some of it forces that they have no idea is happening on them, to them. And so for me, I care about it on both levels.
So, okay, that opens up a whole lot of rabbit holes for me. So number one, when you're sitting in this company of this family and you see this poverty and you say, it reminds me of home, did it remind you of how you grew up, or did it remind you of what you saw around you?
This is a good question. So the power of immigration here, right? My father came to the US I was very young. I had flickering images of my father, but my father came to the US when I was really, really young. I lived in a village, in a small village that, when at some point the folks here, let's go back home. I love taking people back home. And so my life among people in that village was super privileged. Everything is all relative, right? Relatively speaking, it was super privileged. I went to a private school, which my family didn't have a car, so we actually had to walk, right? So when I hear like older people, there's older Black men in my neighborhoods who was like, I had to walk 3 miles to school, and I'm like, yeah,
uphill both ways.
I did, yeah. I did that too, like
Yeah.
literally. So I had to do that as well. But my father could always send some money home. And we know remittances is what props up a lot of, folks who are from developing countries. And so these are things that I saw. These are things that I didn't experience to the extent that the folks around me experienced, but these are things that I saw. And the arc of my life is that I got to, in some ways, come to the US and was able to live out my aspirations. It's not to say that I wouldn't be who I am today if I was not in the US or if I stayed back in Ghana, but certainly the doors that have been open to me here it's just been a lot more than I think some of my peers back home. And in fact, I think the thing that always stuck in my head for me is that thinking about my friends back home, who I was not I was one of the smart kids in the class, but I was not the smartest kids in the class.
Okay.
And so I always think about it, right? Like,
Right.
What if Samuel or Aaron or Rita, or I can keep naming it. When I got tenure at Davidson, these kids, my peers who are in Ghana, were the first people that I thought about, which is that this is for them too. And some of them traveled elsewhere, but some of them didn't get to leave the country. And so we can have this very same conversation on the micro level, right? Billy's family. We can have it on a neighborhood level, West Charlotte, Southside Chicago, wherever else. We can have it on a state level. Yep. Right. We can have it on a national level, and we can have it on an international level. And all of this holds. When you and I talk, when we talk about belonging, you often mention that like we want to pay attention to what we have in common. And my pushback always is that I find that uninteresting, completely uninteresting at all. What I find very, very interesting is what distinguishes us. Right? What makes us different, one, and why is it that because we're a little bit different from each other, we deem some people to belong to the family of humanity more than others? Maybe that's a whole bunch of other stuff too.
Well, so there's a lot of stuff here too to unpack. So, but first I'm going to ask you, why are their differences so much more appealing? I know why I like our commonalities. I know what I want from that. What is it that you get from looking at the differences? Okay.
So I think our commonalities are interesting too, but for me, it's like, if we're all human, which, we all agree that we are.
Sure.
Let me preface this by saying that my question is, what does it mean to be human? My answer to that is, to be human is to belong, right? To be human is to belong, because that's just above and beyond a lot of different things. Even, if you look at Maslow's stuff, the heart of a lot of this stuff is like, the social aspect. We're social beings. And if we don't,
you can't be isolated.
Exactly.
Yeah, you wither and die.
Exactly. We have to belong. Yep. Okay. So then if we're all human, therefore we all have to be along. So what is it? Once we get past that, is it interesting that like people in Oaxaca, Mexico also make really great music? I may not know the music, but if I hear it and it's amazing, I'm not surprised, because we're supposed to make it. Like if I go and like they make amazing food that I've never had, or some community in New Zealand that I've never met, they make incredible art. None of that is surprise. It's interesting to me, but none of it is surprising to me anymore, right? Like if I go anywhere and I see any human being do anything that's amazing, that's not it's interesting to me, but that doesn't move me at all. I mean, I shouldn't say it doesn't move me. It moves me, but I'm not surprised. Like it
So what
doesn't.
moves you?
Okay. What I find interesting then is that like, okay, so how is it that our difference is what moves me? Because it's based on our differences that we've constructed an entire world where certain people get to be more human than other people, right? The construction of that isn't based on what we have in common. It's strictly based on our differences, a lot of which we've totally made up.
Well, all of them are totally made up, right? I mean, really, all of them. Pretty much they're all made up. But our commonalities, go ahead.
No, I think they're all made up, but I think certain ones, like the grounds on which we hold some of them are stronger than the grounds on which we hold others. So for example, we take nations, right? Back to Ghana, there's a tiny little country next to Ghana called Togo, and there's another one named Benin. Why is Togo a different country? Because some folks in some room in Europe somewhere drew those lines and made them different countries. They speak the same language.
And they said, this is mine, right? This is mine.
Right. And so part of it is
this is mine.
Exactly. So I think part of it is that like we however we do it, and for me, what I find interesting is we do it differently based on where you're at. And so our ability to draw the lines and decide that this is them, utterly fascinating to me. Because you would go to, you go to France and you realize, oh man, like y'all dislike North Africans more than you dislike Black people. I thought everybody hated Black people equally, right? But it turns out that you could go somewhere and there's somebody else that gets treated worse, right? Or you would go to Ecuador when I was studying abroad there. Yeah, I can't stand Colombians. Wait, how did that? I thought you're neighbors. When you come to America, we put y'all together, call you Latinos or Hispanics, whatever that term means, right? And we say, right? And then you could go to a different, and we do all of it totally different. That I find utterly fascinating.
I agree. Okay, so where I come from.
Wait, did you just say you agree? That means our longstanding debate is settled?
No, it's not settled. Oh. No. I agree with you that we do that. And I agree with you that we do that, but I don't think, I'm trying to figure out, do we do that to belong? Because I will tell you, here's what I do to belong. When I meet somebody, like when you and I meet, I know that there's 3 things you and I can connect on. Number 1, you're married. We can connect on that. I've been married. You have a baby. We can connect on that. I've had babies, right? You love food. We can connect on that because I do too.
Angela, I think that's true, but you line up 500,000 people around the world and we could do the same thing with them.
But that's right. But that's my point. So can't I belong? So, okay, I told you this story before. I'm going to tell it for the group, right? So I told you about me going in to teach meditation, and mostly it's in Title I schools. And the only people that I generally look like are some of the teachers, right? So here are these kids faced with someone who does not look like them. The school that I was in at the time was Ashley Park over on Wilkeson Boulevard. And the street behind that is where I started my life. Right. And down the street was where my grandmother lived. So when I go into this school, the way I saw myself was, I'm just Angie sharing with these kids what I know because it's something that helped me. And I think maybe it can help them. Right. And then I go to a person who is in the position of funding these types of efforts. And he said to me, the last thing those children need are a middle-class white woman coming in to save them. Stop me dead in my tracks. Never thought of myself that way. The next day I walk into that school.
I'm sorry. Which part did you never think of yourself, that you're middle class, that you're white, or that you're a woman, or all of them?
So I know all 3 of those things, but in connection to what I was doing, never occurred to me. Never occurred to me that number 1, I was trying to save them, because that's not what I was doing.
Mhm.
That was not my mission anyway. That's not how I saw it. Number two, I didn't see myself as separate from them.
Okay. So
I'm a kid
this,
that grew up around there, right? Well, I'm finished yet. Let me finish.
oh, I'm sorry.
So no, it's okay. So I get in there with these kids. We can connect on all kinds of levels, right?
Mhm.
I told you about my second grader. It's like, what's your favorite emotion that makes you feel bad? He said, worry. I said, what do you do? He said, well, I go get the bag of chips. I said, well, what do you do next? He goes, I eat the whole bag.
Mhm.
I said, how do you feel after that? He goes, my tummy hurts. I don't feel good. I'm like, yeah, that was my favorite too. And I went for the ice cream with peanut butter and my tummy hurt too. Right. So now we're Angie and Nick, right? We're having this conversation and we're connected now because there's
Mhm.
something in common. And I didn't see myself that way. But once that man put that in my head,
Mhm.
now I walked into that school differently.
Mhm.
And I started wondering how many people see me this way.
Mhm.
I knew the kids didn't see me that way. I knew it, but I didn't know. And I knew it by the way they engage,
Mhm.
but I didn't know how the teachers saw me. I didn't know how their parents saw me. And I wasn't able to be myself
Mhm.
until I caught myself and what was
Mm.
holding me back, what
Mhm.
made this different experience for me.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So he put that in my head. And I guess my point is twofold. In one, I find commonality there, and that's my focus. And that's how I connect,
Mhm.
right? That's how I feel like I belong. And I do feel like I belong in that school. They may not all feel that way, but what they feel, that's none of my business. I can't do anything about it except be who I am, right?
Yeah.
So I realized at that point, I had some responsibility in my feeling of belonging and
Mhm.
rejecting something someone else wanted to project on me.
Mhm. Um, and we've talked about this. I think what you do in those schools are fantastic. I think you're empowering them with certain tools that allows them to deal with the things that they're dealing with. I think what I might say, or someone else might say, is that, like, yes, you do have things in common with those folks, as including how it is that you deal with some of these emotions that come about. But I think they would make the argument that the differences between you and them is precisely why their school is in the shape that it's in.
Mm.
The difference being whiteness and the difference meaning middle classness. The gendered one, you're going to vibe with a whole bunch of the folks who identify themselves as women in the school, including the young girls and women's in there. And they're going to, that's another struggle that's going to have to be teased out.
Indeed.
But a lot of them will make the argument that the whiteness and the middle classness is part of the reason why their school is in the state that it is. And if they said that, they wouldn't be making it up, right? Because
No, I
we know
agree.
over and over again that some of those things are true. So for me, that's part of the reason why if we can identify the things that make us different and try to figure out why we're different and try to and oh, by the way, we don't, not all our differences lead to, not all our differences result in differential life outcomes, right? There's certain aspects of our difference that we don't pay attention to at all. I have really small ears, right? I do. That seemed to not matter in my life outcome at all. And we can point to other things. Some of them are these real differences. Some of them are even more arbitrary differences, right?
Right.
And some of them are, and some people, and I love sports because I think it's probably one of the most intense areas where we mark our difference, but the differences there don't lead to differences in life outcomes. I mentioned this to you before, and I said this on Mark's podcast when he interviewed me as well. Clemson, Alabama, or I'm a football fan, Arsenal, like European football stuff, like Arsenal, Tottenham, or you pick any sports teams, the Yankees, Red Sox. It's intense. That's not made up. they don't like each other, right?
Yeah.
But as far as I know, there's no research that shows that Red Sox managers aren't hiring Yankees applicants. That I don't see it. Like I don't know if that research exists. Maybe it does, but that I just don't know about it. And so my thought here is that like we got to figure out how to not wish away our differences, because I want to be Black. I want to be Black forever. I don't want to stop being Black.
Yeah.
Right. And I want the difference in my race to stick. I don't want it to go away. And I want my friends who are trans to be trans, and I want my friends who are queer of whatever branch to be that. I want everybody to and embrace whatever it is that and include in what brings us together. So if we all get together under some tent and we're vibing out to whatever music that we all like, that's all great. But what I would like is, how is it possible for us to see, respect, understand our differences and not let those differences lead to differential life outcomes? That's what keeps me up at night.
And our argument is, mine is, I don't think you can change it universally until you change it on the personal. Until we understand it on such a personal level, where are we creating those boundaries? Where are we saying that I belong here and you don't belong in my sphere here? But that takes a look at one's own life that's really hard to do.
I agree with you. We got to change the personal, but I think about Billy's grandkids. If we're waiting for all the personal people to change their minds and their hearts, Billy grandkids and great grandkids and great great grandkids, it's just going to take decades and decades before they get anywhere. And I just don't. I'm an impatient person, I guess.
Well, no, I hear your point. I think change has to happen at both levels.
Absolutely.
But without changing it personally, I think what we can start putting measurements in place and this, but where, that only inches us forward. It has to do it, but I think it's a both. It's not an either or.
So I think it's a both. And then what we then do here is we look in the past of our own country and say, okay, we take something like Jim Crow laws. Did we have to change the hearts and minds of people first, or did we have to change the laws first? Right. And then we got to figure out which one we did first to get to what we need. I think you're absolutely right that it's a symbiotic thing. Things are happening together and it always happens. But and some things change very quickly. I mean, keep in mind, Obama was the first sitting president to publicly state that they're in favor of same-sex marriage. It's not that long ago. And it's Obama, like progressive boy Obama, right? Who, like not too long ago, but not too long ago, Obama would not say in public that same-sex marriage is something that should be protected. So that something like that happened fairly quickly. It's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination for LGBTQ folks, but it's something that is been a part of the conversation. So all of this stuff can happen.
Agree, but we've been dealing with this since the beginning of time. And my point is that we can change this for the places where we know we need that change, right? And those laws that need to change, those acceptances that need to change, because we can put it back to the Constitution or the law and say, hey, no, this doesn't fit. But the other issue is, what are we going to do next? Who's going to be the next group of people that doesn't fit? Is it going to be the anti-vaxxers? Is it going to be the undocumented?
Right. So
who's that next group?
Right. And so that's the perpetual thing that we have to deal with. Right. So if I had my way, institutions of higher, and I'm going to talk about the world that I know most about, colleges and universities.
Please. Yep.
I would say, let's get rid of, I hope I don't get edited for just saying this part, right? Let's say the whole sentence. I would say, let's get rid of all diversity and inclusion offices and put in Office of Belonging. Harvard is trying this out. So Harvard has Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging. If I had my Office of Belonging at the beginning of the school year, I would sit there and say, okay, who are our students who don't feel like they belong these last couple of years and this year, right? Because America is America, we're going to put Black folks in there because that's a part of it. Even though young women are doing much better in school. If we think about gender in a binary sense, young women are doing better in school, and there's a whole lot more of them. There's still a sense of not quite belonging. And again, when I say belonging, I'm saying if you exist in a space where there are things that prevent you from living your fullest life, right? Those are signs of your belonging. And then we'll say, maybe our trans folks, maybe, but if we did that this year and we came up with a list of 10 different sectors, communities, groups of people that we think don't belong, we work on them. Next year, another list. Next year. And so I'm okay always having a list, but what we end up doing is to understand that belonging is a thing that, as the world changes, the people who feel like they belong or feel like they don't belong, that too will change. And we just have to be okay with that. That, like,
So you're talking about constant monitoring.
Of course.
An office of belonging being a more positive kind of human way of.
That's right. If we get to a point where people with small ears feel like they don't belong in colleges and universities, we got to take that seriously and then figure out, okay, why don't they belong, right? What is it about this space that's preventing them from belonging?
Right.
And what do we do about it? And so for me, that's a perpetual thing that we got to keep going.
It is. And then the other piece to that is, where within ourselves do we feel like we don't belong? And is that something we've accepted? And do we have a responsibility within to reject that?
I don't think I understand. So to reject if we feel like we don't, I mean.
Yeah. So that man obviously put that in my head that I didn't belong in that school, right? And they didn't need me doing what I was doing because of who I am. I had to reject that. And that is a very singular thing. It's a different thing when you're talking about an entire culture telling you you don't belong. That's harder to recognize and harder to deal with. I get it. But I also think that has to be addressed.
I think so too. But I think in that particular instance, if we put this in the context, you may have to understand that this man has probably seen a bunch of white middle class women come.
Sure, he has.
And so that's part of what he may be responding to, is that well, I've seen this story before, and what they did was probably not as impactful, as useful, as what it is that you think you're doing. And so,
but he made a judgment based on his experience, which is what we all do.
I think that's true. And I think we have to figure out how to move forward and move past that. Yeah. And I also think that if some of us who are privileged enough to walk into these spaces to try to make a difference, I think that's a price you pay. You just that's part of what you just gotta.
Well, right. But I'm talking about universally. If you feel like you don't belong because you're in this space of, I don't know, a bunch of white women talking about women in leadership, maybe that's something that you need to deal with. That maybe the way you come into it feeling like you don't belong has something to do with the experience you have. That's my point, is personal responsibility for, I am making this judgment, I don't belong here. But what if I walk into it and think, yeah, I do belong here. I know something about leadership, and I have sisters and I have a wife, and I know something about this.
So I think that gets to, how do we gauge how people come to their belonging, right? Whether or not you feel like you belong. I've spent pretty much all my life in colleges and universities. There are moments where I did feel like I belonged and moments that I didn't feel like I belonged. And I think if I went back and looked at it, was some of it my responsibility in getting the oomph? Maybe, but I think a lot of it was also me responding to things that were thrown at me. But I think the other really sort of big space with belonging is that, here's how it often happens. And my quick analogy for that is that, imagine a friend come visit you in your home. If they come, they're newcomers. They would have to ask your permission, because they're newcomers. It's not their home. They don't quote unquote belong there. So where do I put my shoes? Where do I hang my coat? I can't just open the fridge and get something. But imagine that over time they say, okay, I really like it here. If you're okay with me, I would like to move in, right? They move in, they get their name on the lease, or you split the mortgage, and now it's also their space, right?
Mhm.
Yes, you were there first, but even though it's their space, now it's their space. If they say, that futon that you have, I've never really liked it. We got to get rid of it. Or the photo that you have, I don't really. So I think what's happening now, which may be a bit uncomfortable, is that like we are inviting people into our homes. They've stayed there long enough that we're like, no, this is your home for real. And they've put in whatever it is that they put in for it to be the equivalent of them putting their name on the lease or getting their name on the mortgage.
Mhm.
Now they're saying, I don't like the futon's got to go. And we're like, wait, what? Like, you can't, you just got like, I've been living here longer than you've been living here. So you can't tell me the futon, you got to, and it's like, no. People belong if they belong, and we're making the claim that people, and that can be at the school, that can be at your office, that can be in America, that could be in whatever. I think what is happening now, and my students even have more audacity than I did when I was a student, right? When I was a student at Ithaca was a great place, but I felt like I'm passing through. I didn't feel like I completely belonged there. I knew the 10 spaces that I could go to and do what I needed to do to be successful. When I went to Wisconsin, the same way. Get your degree, get out. This wasn't my school. My students today, they're like, no. I'm not just passing through Davidson. I belong here. This is my space. And so if I don't like that futon's got to go. And that's where we're at right now. And people are going crazy about this.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because
Yeah.
it's a hard thing. On the one hand, it's like, you just
Yeah.
got here. And my students are like, no. I just got here, but my grandparents have been here before. And my great-grandparents have been here before. And they all said, when you go to Ithaca, make sure you let them know that you belong there. And that's what they're doing.
Yeah.
And that's
And
what's
that
hard.
forces us to face ourselves
Of
and
course.
each other, right? So it pushes the
course.
point. I think Jennifer's got a bunch of questions in the chat. I'd love to open this up to the group instead of me monopolizing you.
Awesome. Thank you. First up, this conversation is amazing. I have so many notes. And first question up, we have Brian Hadley. I hope I pronounced your name correctly.
You did. Sure. So I'm most of the way through a master's degree at Queen's University in organization development. And as a part of that, we were doing some work in a group project about hiring former military and how you hire former military and the work that you have to do and how former military folks fit or don't fit into an organization. And one of the concepts that came up that was true at the military, and it turned out this to be true in some other areas, is this idea of costly signaling. So in the military, if you wear a medal that you didn't rightly earn, and other people in the military find out about it, there's going to be hell to pay. There is you will be punished severely by your peers for doing so. And as we dug into the concept of costly signaling, this is true. It's a tribal custom that you would do things to your body that were costly, expensive signals that you would have. So a tattoo, a brand, a hairstyle, a piece of jewelry that was really, it cost a lot for you to be able to have that so that people could instantly identify that person is with us, or that person is either they're one of us or they're one of them. And I'm curious from your perspective, how we see that happening today, especially in the Charlotte area, where I don't see, except for a handful of friends that I have that have brands, which are, I think, permanent. A tattoo is darn close to permanent, but the signals that people use right now to identify as us versus them, and I think there are some political signals that I can see. If you have on a red hat that says MAGA on it, I'm going to call you one of them. However, if we're in a store and you have a mask on, you're one of us. And I'm curious how costly signaling is creating a greater division, or maybe on the opposite, it could be utilized to create some more of a feeling of belonging.
Yeah, that's an excellent excellent question. And I'm not familiar with that concept, so I would have to look it up. I think my off the cuff response is, I think all of this feeds into the different ways we mark ourselves as belonging or not belonging. All the different ways that we sort of accept, entertain, recognize each other as being a part of this group. Look, I think I just don't think we will all see each other as the same people all the time, right? That's just not going to happen. And in our minds, we're always trying to group. This groupiness thing happens all the time. And my question always, though, is that, like, how do we assess the consequences of marking somebody as different? What you're suggesting is that in the military or with certain groups of people, having certain markers is supposed to signal something. And if you hadn't earned that something, it means this or that. And I think where we're at today, it's just so easy to put each other in boxes. And then on top, I don't have a problem with the particularly putting each other in boxes part. Because I don't think there's a lot that can be done. Maybe we can do something different about that, but that doesn't bother me as much as making your life. And nowadays, when I'm doing this stuff, I like to use public health research, because public health research, the bottom line is these people are going to live 5 years longer or 5 years shorter than the other person, right? So my problem is, can we get a grip on making, if we put all these people in this box, the people in that box are going to live 5 years shorter than the other people? Like, are these boxes that consequential to us? Or how do we make sure that that's not the case, that's not happening? So that would be the best answer I can give, Brian, is that, like, we're going to continue to mark each other as different. We're going to continue, and there's going to be more hyper different ways of marking ourselves. We like to blame a lot of things on social media. Some of it is deserved, some of it isn't. But it has created this tunnel echo chamber effect where you can gather with only the people who also completely like this particular brand of beer or wine or whatever. Those sorts of things are going to happen. Must the life outcome consequences be as severe in certain instances? That's what bothers me the most.
Got it. Thank you very much. Appreciate that answer.
And I'm going to mention quickly, I saw a comment in here from Roslyn about Togo and Ghana. I think you're talking about that. Yes, Togo is Francophone, Ghana is Anglophone. I wasn't talking about the colonial languages that they inherited. I'm talking about the local language. So both Togo and Ghana speak Ewe. And that's a language that they share. That makes their distinction in two different countries feel more arbitrary.
So are you bringing up somebody else, Jennifer?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, no. I was going to acknowledge something in the chat.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
So next up we have Mike Rilon. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, I'm like Angela. I always don't unmute myself. So hey, Joseph, thanks for being here today. And so I just wanted to have a question. We want everybody to realize their potential and feel like they belong and not feel different. But I'm curiously, have we intentionally been making it harder for them to feel that by us embracing so many outdated ideas? And I'm wondering, especially when I look at are there any lessons to be learned from the research that was conducted by the Federal Reserve Bank and recently published in the Wall Street Journal? And what they found that college has actually widened the wealth gap for Black Americans, right? And I wonder this, and I was working with another nonprofit who focuses in on the Black community and sharing it, because we do a lot of stuff to try to overcome myths and misperceptions and try to move youth towards happiness and prosperity, not just any old college degree. Okay. And he told me, I can't tell kids that. I can't report this information
Mhm.
because in our community, you're not as good as
Mhm.
if you don't have that.
Mhm.
So I, just kind of wondering then, well, aren't we making them feel like they don't belong and they
Yeah.
still can't realize happiness
Yeah.
and their potential because
Yeah.
they probably still do have some unique skills
Yeah.
and characteristics
Yeah.
that, in our world and in America, they can still realize,
Yeah.
their potential within our communities.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so the research you're reporting is one of the more depressing things that I teach sometimes. So when I'm teaching like in school, I put the graphs up. Oh, if you go to college, it returns this much and this and this. And then I have to be like, except for the Black kids, except for these groups of people. And it's totally debilitating and depressing. So then the question is it college that made them? Is it the idea of going to college that is going to worsen that, or is it other things? And it turns out it's not, and maybe I'm biased. As a college professor, I could not say don't go to college. In fact, no, actually, I may have no problem with that, right? Like try to get a plumber nowadays. It takes forever and they get decent living and all those sorts of things. But it's all part of the markers that we're putting on ourselves, right? That like, I'm this, I rise up into this class, having these kinds of occupations give me this level of dignity, so on and so forth. But I think the fact that college is widening the wealth gap is not because, well, it is because colleges are obscenely expensive, and that's just not how we should be doing that. That's the first thing. But I think it's also built on already existing wealth inequality that if you hold colleges constant, still remains the same. Black person with graduate degrees, I still have less wealth than a white person who did not graduate from high school. So you can't college your way out of the wealth inequality. It's built. So I think that's the most ingrained problem that we're going to figure out how to solve. And there's nothing that says that we're going to be able to solve that. So Mike, I hear you. I think if you don't want to go to college, hopefully we create a world in which one can find as much dignity doing non-college professions as we've given college professions. But if you're able to go to college or you want to go to college, one, I hope there's some way where we crack this college system to make it less expensive to go. And then on top of that, we got to get a handle on the wealth inequality because it's just so ingrained in that it really stifles something that I still believe can be as positive in people's sort of life trajectory as spending the time on our college campuses, learning how to think, write, and decipher between different bunches of information.
Yeah, and I'm a high school educator. We're not against kids going to college, but what we really do echo what the Harvard Graduate School of Education said in its groundbreaking 2011 report, and said that we should quit telling kids university and college for all, and we need to replace that with post-secondary for all. After high school, you got to get some education and training, but with regard, especially in today's technology-driven world, but when we only tell them there's one way,
that's right.
I think that's what that report tells us.
That's right.
We've created the actual obstacles for them and their families to break those cycles because they took on too much debt. And they really got too many degrees that don't really deliver in a 21st century modern economy. Yeah,
I think you're absolutely right. Anyway, we can keep on, but I think you're absolutely right. But the key is that the debt difference, right? And if you're coming in with so much, if your family has no wealth at all, and you're entering college, compared to other folks who are coming in with much more wealth, that's just a game that you're not going to win. Anyway, we can talk more about that. That's an important piece.
Hey, Angela, did you record where Joseph said I was absolutely right? Because I want to share that with my my wife and kids, because I don't ever really hear that at all.
Thank you.
Yes, it's being recorded. You are all set.
Yeah, we're recording it right. I wanted to highlight a question in the chat that I think piggybacks on what you're saying here. Piko, when you said the markers of what we put on ourselves, and Bruce Fritsch says, perhaps it would be helpful to clarify, carefully delineate belonging. What is the need for belonging? What is the necessity for belonging? What are the risks of belonging and of not belonging? What are the tests for belonging? Feeling welcomed, feeling safe, feeling authorized, feeling similar, accepted, heard. Are we intrinsically interested in certain kinds of belonging, yet being unique too? And if I may just comment for a second on it, because this is the exact same question I was thinking about my own experience. I was one of the goth kids in high school, and we would hang out on the B wall, and that's where we had to stay. But then we were not accepted in the popular kid group. And I remember wanting to be in it and mad that I couldn't be in it. But then when I did hang around them, what it felt like inside of me is I actually didn't feel like they were my people. Like I didn't feel at home in myself. And so there was this like, oh, I should belong there. It's not fair that I do. But then when I actually got in it, I'm like, this is not actually my vibe.
Yeah.
And it made, I think about that in relationship to what you said and Bruce's comments and questions here as well. What do you think?
Bruce, those are excellent questions. It was the one question I was hoping nobody would ask me, because I haven't teased it all out yet. So, you know, I've been putting this belonging thing in a few little bits of writings about myself, about what I do. And then yesterday, a couple of days before that, I was like, all right, let me start to actually like unpack this theoretically, what it means. And so I just right now just started thinking about it, right? So, and it's something that I have not encountered as much sociologists writing about. I think there's a nice little body of literature in psychology, especially social psychology, where they're talking about social belonging and what that means. There are questions of subjective belonging, objective belonging. In sociology, we do the inverse, which we spend a lot of time thinking about, which is alienation, which is what Marx wrote a lot about. And so we kind of have a sense of like, what does it feel like to not be doing well? And so we've theorized that really, really well. All these questions are really, really important that, Bruce, I hope can we get your contact sometime? I'm happy to continue to think about it and give you a better answer later, but right now I would just butcher it. Not in the sense of like, it's one of those ideas that I think in my gut, there's something there that I want to explore, but I haven't read the literature around it enough to give you the precise answers that I think your question deserves. So I'm going to punt on that one, if that's okay.
I appreciate what you're saying. I'm feeling heard. I feel a sense of belonging.
You feel like you belong, Bruce?
By this dialogue. More than belonging, could it be that we're looking for freedom of opportunity, and that opportunity is a function of inclusion and our differentiation, well valued by others?
That's it. And I think that's where I hang my hat, is that like, no, now that I think about it, I don't think it's just that we want to belong so that we can maximize our life potential. I think we want to belong because intrinsically that is an important human need. I can't tell you where that comes from. I can't tell you precisely what kind of bits of belonging said human actually needs. I can't tell you what it ought to look like, right? I can't tell you any of those things. What I can tell you, what I know to be true, in my gut, but not theoretically right now, is that I think intrinsically we need to be in a space where you can sort of, it's the opposite of alienation. And alienation is just the sense of like, I'm here at this factory, the employer is extracting my labor, and they're gonna give me, you know, these amount of dollars or pounds or whatever, and then I'm gonna take it. But what I'm doing, that's so far from me. That's just not me. That's not There's nothing meaningful, nothing striking inside of me about any of those kinds of things. I think we need that intrinsically. And then on top of that, I think the people with whom we feel like we belong, we bend over backwards to make sure that life is lived in as pleasant a way as possible for those people. And then because we automatically operate in a zero-sum game type thing, the underbelly of belonging and creating an us is that you also have to create a them, right? What Jennifer is saying, if I'm the goth group, I have to distinguish myself from those other groups. Those other groups, in fact, need to exist for me to feel like I'm in my space, right? And so I think once we create an us, a them is automatically generated. And once a them is also automatically generated, then we got to figure out how do we make sure life is easier for us than it is for them, because we're afraid that the them are going to come and take the resources that us needs. And that plays out in itself in every way in our American life system, right? Probably harshest in the American life system. And you can see it in a lot of different places where some places are okay to be like, you know what? Let's make sure that them have healthcare. Like, we don't like them, but let's make sure they have healthcare. In America, we're like, nah, we get healthcare. If y'all can't get your own healthcare, that's your business, right? That's the best I could do right now.
Thank you.
So Jennifer, is there another one?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So I wanted to kind of put this out there to you educators that are there. So we talked about a lot in regards to education, but what if part of our education was to teach empathy and discernment over judgment and ways of being, if you will, lenses that it was important for the way we show up in the world and the way that we interact with each other as a valuable tenant.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that, if we want to start on the personal, but we have to do this broadly, because maybe we can't, not everybody knows the same thing, has the same access to information or skills or whatever, but every child has to go to school. So if we teach those tenets as things to be important in this culture.
I completely agree. I think that's absolutely correct. But we fight about what we can teach our kids at school, because we don't want them to hear certain things. We don't want them to understand certain things. We don't want them, right? The freedom that I love about being a teacher at the higher education level, and especially at a place like Davidson, where we're certainly not unique, but I think they give us the academic freedom to do a lot, is that we can do that. We can do that. There's nothing that brings me more joy my last few years here than teaching classes where Davidson College students are in the same classroom with Johnson C. Smith students. The magic that you're talking about there, it happens. They come together. They see each other as peers. They see each other. Without that, they're two different people. We're us, they're them. Once we break that apart, what happens? You see them actually working together. I'll never forget this day. This young white woman, I might add, had taken a class with me, a class that I taught between Davidson and Smith. She's come into my Davidson College classroom with a Johnson C. Smith t-shirt on. That's marking herself as like, that space that's over there, that's my folks too. And that's the same thing as random people wearing like a UPenn shirt or whatever shirt, right? Like, that's my folks. That's part of me too. And that, right? But we don't do that enough, right?
Well, but we don't think about it because it's not one of the things that anyone ever says is important to think about.
I think we do. We just feel like we got 10 kids to feed. We got to feed our 10 kids and make sure they got breakfast, lunch, dessert, and snack. We're not going to give our snacks to them just because they're them, right? So I think that's, and Davidson has been generous. I get to do these. But I don't think that's possible everywhere. And even with that, there are different battles that go through. So I think that's amazing. I mean, in my head too, I think about city level policymakers, right? What if they got all these kinds of educations and that empathy and things like that you're talking about? I think a lot of the stuff that we're dealing with would not completely eroded, but it would be, we would sort of bring it down a little bit in some ways. So anyway.
Well, I hate to end this conversation. It's 1 o'clock and I must, but I have to read this because it's very quick, y'all. Bear with me because this is for you, Piko. So Piko had every opportunity and reason to walk away from me when we started our friendship. And I won't say that this part of our friendship started off, it was rocky. Was it a little rocky?
I don't think it was rocky because I think the thing that I always appreciated talking with you about is that, like, we can talk. I can tell you, I actually disagree with this. And that's not the end of the conversation. And we can sort of keep going and keep talking and keep going. And I think that's part of it. You know, it's when you run into kind people and generous people, I think that's what Angela was planning my wedding. Right. And so like we had to be friends. Right. So that's where this started. And so I'm grateful I got to do this.
Beyond the wedding, here it is. So this is from Andrew Sullivan in his book, Love Undetected.
Mm-hmm.
Friendship uniquely requires mutual self-knowledge and will. It takes two competent, willing people to be friends. You cannot impose a friendship on someone, although you can impose a crush, a lawsuit, or an obsession. If friendship is not reciprocated, it simply ceases to exist, or rather, it never existed in the first place.
Mm.
And so, as two separate people appreciating their autonomy and different thoughts, still agree to be friends. And maybe that's part of what's missing in our conversation of belonging. So I appreciate you, Piko. And I want to tell everybody else. And I appreciate everything that Piko put into this conversation, all the conversations that preceded it. I want to say thank you for that. And thank you all for being here. And also want to let you all know our next forum event will be the kickoff of Shout on September the 17th with the librettist and composer of the I Dream opera. His name is Douglas Tappan, and that will be at the Stage Door Theater. And then I want to thank all our donors and sponsors again, and our wonderful producer, David Phillips. Thank you, David, for everything. And this concludes our program for today.
Angela?
Yeah.
Can a couple of people are asking how they can follow Piko's work?
Well, yes, of course. And let's we can stay on. I'm just saying goodbye. If anybody has to leave at 1 o'clock, please stay on if you would like to talk. And Piko's agreed to hang out with us for a little bit. And yes, let's ask that question and share that, Piko.
I don't have an Instagram, but I'm on Twitter, I guess, but I don't really tweet that much. I have a book.
You have a book.
Yeah, I have a book coming out towards the end of the year. I'm working with
a previous book too, right?
Yes. So I will try to, and hopefully Angela and this remarkable forum will allow space for me to send information out. I'll probably do a couple of book talks in Charlotte about my book about food in Jackson, Mississippi, which, was life-changing for me. And I learned so much about that. So as that become available, I will share that. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. So, thank you guys for being here. And Piko, I'm just going to share the same about you. Anytime that we've had our disagreements and you've never said no, instead you invited me for a walk.
I think disagreeing over walks is a highly underrated space. It's the best space to disagree because your blood is flowing as your mind is flowing at the same time, and I think it makes these conversations better. So
I agree. And I love our differences. To your point, I will concede that.
Differences is where it's at.
I'm not conceding that far yet.
Differences is where it's at.
Yeah. Does anybody else have any other questions? I still see a bunch of stuff going on in the chat here. Oh, where was that? Bruce, what did you say? All right. Bruce said, ironically, the space of belonging is crowded with codependence. Perhaps we would benefit by considering belonging free of codependence. How's that for a healthy contemplation?
I don't think I know what you mean by that, Bruce.
Is he still with us?
I think he is.
There he is.
The subject of feeling, or the state of feeling not in a belonging state, not accepted, not authorized, not heard, prompts insecurities that can tilt an individual into a direction that can be too interested in gaining acceptance, not grounded, not founded in self-respect. We're all codependent to a certain extent, particularly with our pets. We have a blatant codependence, when we enter and the dog greets us as if we've, they've met the greatest person in the world. But if we don't feel like we're belonging, we can get, it can tip us into an insecurity that ironically isn't something that's very inviting.
But isn't that a lot of where we are?
It is. That's what I'm
Because
saying. I think it's terribly ironic.
Well, I do as well. I mean, so I dropped in the chat Rene Girard and his mimetic theory, which states that others teach us what to desire, what is desirable, right? And Jennifer and I recently had this great conversation. Jennifer, I'm going to butcher it horribly, where she talks about the ancient Greeks and glory. And the glory for them, Jennifer, jump on in here when I screwed up. The glory for them were the things that they were given, right? Were the bride or the woman that they had because of it, the spoils of war that they were given were the glory. And so that's what everyone wanted, because that said, you belong more than anyone else. You're the Holy Grail. And now here our kids are looking at the basketball players, the football players, the movie stars, without sitting back to think, does this fit? I mean, to Jennifer's point, when she was goth and wanted to be part of the popular crowd, we want that because other people are teaching us that that's what we want. And that's the only reason we want it. And once we get there, well, I forgot to look at myself and what suited me.
Yeah.
And that's a different thing than kind of what Piko is talking about, but I think that's very interrelated.
But I don't think there's any other way to create belonging, right? Like, so let's look at ourselves in this forum. Look at what we're wearing. We look ridiculous from another culture's perspective. You see what I'm saying? So like, I mean, everything that we're doing is all based, like whatever we learn to fit in, learn to do, learn to all of those kinds of things. It's totally based on the context in which that we're in, right? Like, so I don't think that there's any true deep inside of you. If I really wanted to belong, decontextualize, this is what I would do or be. The language that we're using, the vehicle that we're using to communicate with each other would be is incomprehensible, just like 5-hour flight south. You know what I mean? You go to Costa Rica, you see what I'm saying? So everything that is about us, I think, is structured in that sense. So Bruce, I love the question that you raised. I don't know if your answer to it is what I would land on. And I don't know what my answer to it either, which is that, like, when you don't belong, then what? Then what happens to you? Then how do you carry yourself? Then how do you sort of manage yourself? How do you, or does the human, because it's an inherent thing to believe, is the human unendlessly creating many groups to belong? Even if you're just by yourself, are you just like imagining a world in your head where my oldest stepdaughter was at a stage where she's a quieter person by herself? She could tell you all about her imaginary friends, like with some level of detail that was borderline, like I was talking to my wife, should we be worried about this? With the sense of detail so for her, it's like, yes, I don't. And at the time she was an only child. Yes, I don't belong with anybody, but my friends in my head, I definitely belong there. Thankfully, that's changing a little bit. So that would be a one other possible potential sort of answer to that question.
I think a lot of the concern is really around dealing with authority and seeing ourselves authorized, and in a context that is social and not so self-absorbed and individuated that we can rationalize all kinds of crazy behavior. So there we're really talking about an adult and not an adolescent. It's a very difficult thing. Business schools don't teach about authority. We don't learn about authority in the way that helps us to discern our authority and the appropriate authority of others. 70% of the American workforce is disengaged, according to Gallup. And the reasons for that, two are generally cited. One is that there is not a higher purpose presented by executive leaders that stirs and connects the heart and mind of the employees. The other reason is that there's a very high level of fear and apprehension in the culture. So our relationship to authority, our ability to see ourselves as authorized and to learn how to become competent and how to deserve agency, to deserve authority, is a very, very tough lesson. And I think that teachers need to get much more expressive about it.
Okay.
That's a disease of society, not just
Absolutely.
corporations, right?
Absolutely. The disease part is that we feel ourselves to be insufficient.
Yeah.
We have the fear of insufficiency, which is at the core of so many insecurities. It arises in family of origin experience. But how many parents realize that? We parent the way we were parented, generally speaking. We spend more time getting certified as a Microsoft Office expert than we do in getting certified as an adequate parent or leader. It's ironic. It's terribly ironic.
Yeah.
And so we talked about belonging, but I would suggest that a parallel would be to talk about our relationship with authority, both with self and others.
I have no disagreement in that.
Could I ask a question if we still have time?
Please.
This is going to be jumbled. And I'm wondering, Joseph, you can say a bit about kind of positioning your work and the concerns you've talked about today in the context of, so I hear you say, one idea is we're all going to make these distinctions. We're going to create these groups and these differences. The idea is how do we create a society in which that doesn't hold people back perpetually, kind of as being a goal. And I can think of like liberals, small L liberals, hearing that and saying that that's exactly what liberalism has offered us. The idea that we can embrace that kind of natural tendency toward difference in a way that doesn't preclude us from creating societies in which we can give equal opportunity or overcome that. And clearly something it has broken. And I think you hear a lot of people on the left and the right really talking about kind of the crisis of that worldview. I'm wondering if you would say, is some of the difficulty here that we are maybe intellectually ill-equipped to think about how to go about doing this because we just don't have a framework in which to conceptualize
Yeah.
the kind of society we need to build.
Yeah.
And then the second question would be, one, I think maybe not illegitimate concern that you hear from liberals is a move away from strong individualism, maybe not hyper individualism, but strong individualism, is that it, really creates kind of dangers for protection of individual rights. If we start thinking a lot about belonging and grouping as kind of the framework in which we think about political problems going forward, that there are going to be some dangers that might kind of creep in as a result.
Yeah. So these are tough questions, and really important ones, and ones that I think about a great deal. Probably the most professionally, one of the most important works that I'm engaged in right now is something that I'm calling Smith-Davidson Leadership Initiative. I take 5 Davidson students, 5 Johnson C. Smith students, and I take them as sophomores. And my mission goal really is to see if we gave them the right training, could they become city, state level policymakers, right? So I grab them when they're sophomores. The summer after their sophomore year, they just finished this first cohort. They just finished it this summer. They get an internship somewhere in the city where they're working with, I had folks working with criminal justice reform folks, or environmental justice reform folks, or housing folks, or economic development folks. The summer after their junior year, they'll go wherever in the country. So if you're here in Charlotte this summer, next summer, go to Oakland or Detroit and see how Oakland or Detroit is dealing with that problem. And then when they're done, when they're graduating their senior year, my goal, my wish for them, obviously I can't determine, this is like my wannabe social engineering, right? I can't force them into a career. I can't make them do whatever, but my hope is that I have enticed them enough to know that the problems that we're facing should be thought about very, they should think really hard about fixing these problems at the local city, state, county level, even that. And so your question is, how do I equip them in here's the world, go forth, and what's the philosophy that I want to send them into the world with, right? Because we're at the standstill where we don't know what to do. There's a book that has been really rocking my mind, and as it relates to this, it's called Manifest Destiny. It's a sociologist, Michelle Jackson at Stanford, that wrote it. I've read it a few times. The thing that is not quite feasible yet, and I don't know quite how to do it yet, but the thing that she suggests is that we have to find a way to connect the fate of our lives. We have to find a way to connect the fate of our lives. And Angela and I were talking about this. And it's kind of crazy, right? But I think with all of these kinds of things, the intellectuals are going to give us the craziest version of it, and we got to find a way to bring it back down in a way that's feasible. So imagine this, right? Angela mentioned that she's 12 weeks now. Oh, she's going to be 12 weeks on Friday. I have a young child. What if I got assigned a young mother who is growing up in poverty? Let's say somebody in a young white family in Mooresville, or a young Black family who actually, in terms of income wise, at least, because we can't do wealth because I don't have that much, right? But if we think about it, that they make less than me. And what if my daughter, my littlest one, her name is Sefi. What if for every decision that I'm making for Sefi, I can't make it until this young mother who are poorer than us are also able to make the same decision, right? So I aspire that my child speaks different languages and travels and da-da-da. What if we linked our fates? Because I think what we are coming to is that we can't do drive-by social good anymore. And in fact, every time people have solved problems in a real and lasting ways, they've linked their fates together, right? So if you have the charter school is essentially a bunch of folks saying, you know what? This school system is not working no more. Why don't we all get together, figure out what works for us, put it together, go to the state and say, all this taxes, y'all not using it right. Give us the money. We'll do it ourselves. Bam. We're going to create our own school and we move forward, create a board, da-da-da. We're creating another sense of an us though, right? Because we're doing it for ourselves, right? That's what hyper-resourced schools are, is a bunch of richer folks who say, and in fact, that's how we choose where we live. Where do I want to buy a house? I want to buy a house near the other rich people who also are all in the same place, because if we're just pooling our resources and our taxes together and moving forward. So there's got to be a way. This is the high level theoretical sort of potential idea for it. There's got to be a way where we link our faiths. And if the more we can make that claim for linking our faiths is how we solve some of these problems, I think that the better we move forward. That's not feasible because we are not interested in that at all right now, right? This is because we're so entrenched in this us and them thing. So I'm thinking through it. I don't know how to do that. The cohort, I have them reading a lot of James Baldwin, and I think at the core of what Baldwin was talking about is trying to say, hey, the other case to be made actually, and this is if we can hear somebody, we can have folks hear us. This is the way of doing the linking the faith stuff, is to say, research is telling us that in countries where the inequalities are largest, democracy is more fragile. That's one way of linking our faiths. Yeah, like you can be in your neighborhood and all your kids can go to all the best schools and the private schools and all those sorts of things. But if this thing keeps moving, you're not gonna, Venezuela, you're not gonna have the peace of mind to enjoy this whatever thing that you think you've created. So part of it is continuing to make that case, I guess, and continuing it to, I guess for me, I make the case to my students for them to believe that that's what's important. So that's a botched, incomplete, probably unacceptable answer to the first question. And I was so focused on trying to answer that well that I didn't get the second question.
No, that's more than that. I mean, it's interesting that kind of at the base of that is a view of people as contextualized as opposed to decontextualized. I mean, yeah. I think that the lesson that like Rawls, for example, would take your example and say, as long as your action doesn't make the mother in Huntersville worse off,
right,
it's fine. But there's no concern. It's completely individual focused, completely detextualized actors making their decisions about what is.
Yeah. So the second one was an infringement on individual freedom. And this vaccine is forcing us to think about that, right? Like, fine, you don't want to get vaccinated? Okay. And I guess in some ways, as an American, even a newer one, even an immigrant American, I have to defend your right to not want to get vaccinated. But what are we doing? Like, I get that theoretically, right? You have a right to not wear your mask. I get it theoretically. And so the New York Times Daily did this thing where they're talking to anti-vaxxers. And it was fascinating. This woman, Florida grandmother, passed away because she held a high school graduation party where an aunt spread the virus, ended up killing grandmother. Crying, we were close to all of that stuff. Just that I still believe in my right to not get vaccinated. We don't know what, I don't know what to do. That's the very paradox of what this country is, right? My wife is French. In France, it's now law. You can't take the Paris subway if you can't show a vaccine, a card. Her French self, she's like, yeah, crazy. Like, this, put the law down. Everybody has to do it. One, there's no way that happens in this country because things are passed on the state level and on a national level in the same way. There is something intriguing about this country. And again, as an immigrant, I get it even more than Native American born, however we want to say that, right? So I get that. I understand that, really profoundly understand that. I recognize that part of what attracts me to this country and what keeps me here is that idea. But it has to be controlled. It has to be curtailed in a certain way. I'm not saying if you don't want to get vaccinated, I don't know if I'm going to say that, fine, let's make everybody get vaccinated. But you can hold that to be true, but we're dying. We're literally dying as well. What do we do with that? And the vaccine, for me, like the COVID is an awful, sad instance of it. But what I'm concerned about is the slow death that comes with all these other things that we're literally sitting here and making the same, like, yes, us progressive people got vaccinated, but what about all the health inequities that have existed already? We're dying at the same rates with that stuff too. So what are we doing? Right? That's the stuff that really, I just, we can't keep moving forward like this. And it can't, like, conversations are good, but it can't be conversations. And so my only hope now is I get 10 students a year with this policy thing. And I'm hoping that we can push them forward enough that at some point they're in the city councils, they're doing something and make these decisions. Because that's what I know to do now. And we all just got to pull our weight and figure out how to do it. There's a thought about belonging and identity in the chat too. And this is something that stuck in my head. I also think less focus on identity, more focus on belonging. I like identity. I told you, I want to be Black forever. I don't want any instance where our racial identity gets washed away because I don't want that, right? Like, I like the aesthetics of Blackness, right? I want to continue to grow in the positive presentations and representations of masculinity. I like that, right? It's got to be healthy and good. But I don't want us to be identity-less. I don't want the stuff to go away, right? But I also don't want it to be so consequential. So if we do belong, and you can be whatever you want to be in with certain degree, but we just need to make sure that you're doing well. So I like the coupling together of belonging and identity, and I think one should be submerged under the other. I just saw that quickly, and it wasn't really a question, but I just thought I might ask.
Wait, which one is submerged under which?
Belonging is higher.
Belonging is higher. Identity is here. Got it.
Belonging is higher in my opinion.
Yeah. Hey, we agree. That's awesome. Piko, thank you so much. Really appreciate all your time and your energy and your spirit.
I appreciate this. This was a nice primer to getting back to teaching. My first, what's today? Wednesday. Next week, exactly at this time, I will be in my 3-hour seminar on transnationalism. So I'm excited about.
Sounds like fun.
Yeah, it is going to be fun. So I appreciate this. Thank you so much, Angela, for following up to making sure this happens. I know we've been talking about this for a while. We hoped we could do this in person, but we're not there yet.
Not there yet.
And so I appreciate all your time and your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Piko.
All right.
All right, you guys.
We'll see you all soon.
All right. Thanks.